Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Management Audit Committee. Our first meeting of the 2023 interim is June 20th of 2023. There are a number of us here in the Capitol, and I see at least one member attending online. Welcome, Representative Conrad. I think first things, if you have phones or devices that make noises, maybe silence them. That would be appreciated. And then let's start with our roll call.
Representative Conrad?
Here.
Representative Knapp?
Here.
Representative Nyman?
Here.
Representative Uttman? Here. Representative Sherwood?
Here.
Senator Beitman?
Excused.
Senator Furphy?
Here.
Senator Giroux?
Here.
Senator Nethercott? Here. Vice Chair Brown?
Here.
And Chairman Barlow.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. And Representative Conrad, if there's any difficulties in your format, you make sure you let us know. Either send Lily or Kelly or somebody an email if you're having any challenges with the technology, please.
Yes, sir. You sound and look good.
Thank you. All right. There's a couple just basic things we need to accomplish. First things first. As you folks know, this is actually a statutory committee, not a rules-based committee. So it's not something that we adopted as a 67th legislature. It's actually something that's in statute. And one of the unique things about this committee is it's a co-chair and a chairman. The chairman is the opposite of the chairman on management council. And then the house opposite of that gets an additional member. So you will note there are 5 senators on this committee and 6 House members. Now, I know this is technical stuff, but the first thing we need to do is, if there's no objection, is accept the 6 nominees from the House. Because the way it technically in statute is, the House Speaker appoints 5, and then we get to pick the 6th one as a committee. But since this has happened before, and I was there, so absent objection, we don't want to even take a vote on anything. Absent objection, you want to be picked off the island? You want voted off the island? Absent objection, we'll just accept all of the 6 members from the House to Management Audit Committee. Any discussion on that? Any objection? All right. They come with candy, I was told. All right, so now we have a complete committee, 6 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate. The other thing that this committee has done because of the structure of it is we just vote as an entire committee. There is no House side or Senate side. It's the committee as a whole. That's something that also is, I guess, structured after the way it's the statutory structure. So the rules, while we have rules, the standard rules would apply to that out of our rules book that we adopted as a 67th legislature. So unless there's any discussion on how we're going to operate, we'll operate just as the rules are, but we'll operate as a single committee and vote on that in that manner. Anything there? Saying nothing? All right, we have Ms. Lower, Ms. Sharp, and just went dead, Pierre, Monsieur Pierre here, and they are supporting us. And, Matt Obrecht, there you go. I'm sorry, I was looking over. So is there anything I've missed, Lily, in the introduction as far as rules? Oh, absentee voting. So absentee voting is obviously something we as a committee decide if we want to allow within our committee. I guess my view is, an absentee means you didn't attend the meeting, but we leave the roll open and allow someone to vote at another time. Is that an accurate representation? Director Obrecht, good morning. Is that an accurate representation, or am I?
Mr. Chairman, I think that is an accurate representation.
in the Wyoming legislature, in the past, and even in our rules, in your rules, use the term proxy voting to mean absentee voting. And I think the legislature clarified those two terms in the adoption of the Manual of Legislative Procedure. Proxy voting in Congress and in some other legislative bodies is actually where one member provides another member with their vote. And they don't tell them how to vote, they just say they can vote for them. And that's never been allowed in the Wyoming legislature. So we've clarified that. Absentee voting is where a member leaves a vote on a matter, but isn't there physically for that vote. And the Manual of Legislative Procedure says that absentee voting is up to the discretion of the chairman, but is always limited to only those members who have heard a substantial portion of the discussion on the matter on which they're leaving an absentee vote.
Thank you, Director Obrecht. So any questions or thoughts from the committee? Representative Nyman.
Just a curiosity question. Who determines substantial? I mean, is that just by the
I think that's the way the wording is, it's a prerogative of the chairman to
very good.
make that determination. Anything else? I mean, if there's no objection, we'll just keep absentee as an option, because there will be people that have to maybe a competing meeting on the same day. You sit in for one topic and then you're going to come back to it. We have actually that on our agenda today. We have a potential executive session where we're going to get some more information. Anyway, so I think there's reasons to have the option available. And we won't, if we get to a question, obviously, and you don't think I made the right call on somebody's absentee participation, the committee can overrule me. That's the way the system works. So, yes, Representative Ottman, you had a question or comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to say, do we currently have a member that would apply to at this moment?
I don't know that there's anybody here that plans on leaving in the middle part of the day, but that's the scenario that it would be part of, is if Representative Brown had to go, made it through 2/3 of the testimony on a particular issue, had to leave, but kind of thought he knew enough, he could leave an absentee vote, leave the meeting, and his vote would count.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yep, thank you, ma'am. Senator Grew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to clarify, Senator Brightman, who is not here physically at all.
He would not be eligible for an absentee vote because he is not participating in the meeting and would not have knowledge of the proceedings. So the way I understand and read it, I think we're all on the same page. So absent any objection, we will have the ability to use absentee votes, just like you would during the session, right? You know that when you go to a committee meeting, you listen in and then you can go on. So, all right. Anything further just logistically that we need to cover, Ms. Director, Ms. Sharp? All right. Folks, you'll recall the Management Council gave us 4 topics. They're all on our agenda today. They're basically overviews. The first topic is probably the one that will take more discussion, and maybe we won't actually decide on any action until the end of the day when we get to final directives out of this, just because we have, how many members have served on this committee before? 5 of us. So there's several of us. So anyway, but it still takes, we still have to understand what some of these options are when it comes to this committee and its purpose. So, and then our Department of Audit, of course, and then the 2 things that were brought or assigned to us by Management Council, which is the confirmation process and state lands. So I think we can have a fairly timely meeting. I've asked everyone, all of our presenters, to give executive summaries and then take questions, because they've provided us all their materials in advance. And so the hope is not to walk through all the presentations word for word. The hope is we've all done our homework, and we'll move through and then we get to the discussion and actually moving things forward. So with that, Director Obrecht, thank you for being here. Good morning. If you'd like to start us off with our audit and evaluation study.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Management Audit Committee, Matt Obrecht, LSO. We're going to discuss the program evaluation function within LSO, and maybe by the end of the day, have this committee make a recommendation to Management Council on what you may want to do with that function. So by way of background, we sent out some material, Lily and I, late last week on the history of the program evaluation function in LSO and kind of where we are right now with that function. And where we are right now is we currently do not have a program evaluation function within LSO. This committee is being staffed by Lily, who is the administrator of our research and program evaluation division, and by the research staff within that division, by Kelly and Pierre. Kelly and Pierre aren't true auditors. They aren't program evaluators. They were hired and continue to serve in the role as research analysts. And what that means and how that differentiates between what we used to call program evaluators is a researcher will get a question from a committee or from an individual legislator, a non-legal research question, and any more, maybe not budget or fiscal focused or 100% focused at least. And I'll say this, there's all sorts of gray areas there. I mean, because any question you really ask has a monetary component and potentially a legal component to it. But they will then gather that information, research it, and present it back to the legislator. It's devoid of any sort of policy recommendations. And that's for the legislator to decide what they want to do with that information then at that point in time. And if it's to a legislator, it's actually confidential unless the legislator waives that confidentiality. If it's to a committee, it is generally a public document. But, and while in developing those research products, they'll work with executive branch staff or judicial branch staff or the federal government or local government. It's not a program evaluation as we've historically defined that term. And when we say program evaluation within the Wyoming legislature, within Title 28, what we mean is that this committee assigns to what used to be our program evaluation division a task to go review a program within the executive or judicial branch, or sometimes within local government or within the public schools to find out whether that program is meeting the legislative intent and is acting within the statutes. We've done, I don't know, I think within the last 15 to 20 years, we've probably done 75 different program evaluations. They began to take longer and longer to do for a number of reasons. I think the most, the biggest driver on that was actually the complexity of government programs. And that really started to see an increase in the complexity of government programs about the time the LSO was stood up in the 70s. That's when the federal government started enacting programs such as the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, different health programs, where the states had a component in making sure that those programs were implemented on a statewide level. And so the state government grew in response to those federal programs. And then the program evaluation division at LSO was asked to evaluate those more complicated programs. Well, the way we always worked here was between about 4 to 6 to 7 evaluators. And that is probably the smallest program evaluation function in the country. It always had been. It worked fairly well if we could retain staff and if we had a small, discrete, easily understandable program in which to evaluate. But our staff more and more was asked to evaluate incredibly complicated programs, such as early childhood development, was one that was an evaluation we did when I first became director. I think actually it was already a topic when I was director, and that was in 2016. Actually took us 2 audits to do that, and I think almost 3 years. That involved 2 or 3 executive branch agencies that stand up that program, I think 2 or 3 federal agencies, and all sorts of local stakeholders. And the question was, you know, all this money we're spending on early childhood education in the state, is it seeing the benefits that we want? And really the answer is it's almost impossible to tell given the data, given the disparity in how children develop. And how can you tell that those who have received early childhood education, but we spent a long time and an incredible amount of resources on that, and nothing came of that particular evaluation. At least there was no legislation. There may have been some minor changes within some executive branch policies, but the question was whether the legislature wanted to keep allocating this amount of resources for a program evaluation function that maybe wasn't seeing the highest return. And frankly, also the legislature was making demands on other divisions within LSO, particularly within our budget fiscal division, and to a lesser extent within our legal division, that either we had to expand our budget at LSO or we had to cut positions in what we were doing. And what we tried to do for a while was have the program evaluators kind of play dual roles, be researchers, staff other committees, and then still try to do evaluations. And it didn't work very well at all, really. We'd seen quite a bit of attrition in those positions. And finally, when Lily's predecessor, Abby Bodewins, decided to leave to go back to the Attorney General's office, and our last true program evaluator retired in January, Carla Smith, I just thought it was a great time to really take a look at the program evaluation function and what the legislature wanted out of that function. Because the other component was this committee and the program evaluation division, when I started here in 2006, it had a lot of champions within legislative leadership. And it may have been utilized at a higher level. But I think that the focus started to change in the legislature away from that committee, but the amount of resources that we were devoting to it didn't really change until I became director. And I thought there had been a disconnect on what we were doing and what the legislature really wanted. So that was part of the reason too for going out for this RFP, to get a consultant to look at what we're doing, meet with stakeholders, meet with legislators, staff, executive branch, judicial branch, and find out what this function should look like, or whether we even want this function anymore at all. And when I say that, it's not that the legislature can't evaluate executive branch programs without a program evaluation division within LSO. We do it all the time, actually. You can think of task forces as actually an evaluation of a program. You can think of management council interim topics to joint interim committees as a form of an evaluation. Now, it's not a true audit in the sense that we don't have an independent division that goes in and gets confidential information and evaluates the data independently of the executive branch agency, but it still is a review of those programs. We've also, in the past, hired consultants to review executive branch procurement The last one was the Joint Appropriations Committee and software programs within the executive branch. So, Mr. Chairman, I guess for this committee, besides the discussion and questions for Lily and I on the program evaluation function historically, what you're being asked today is, and we can discuss this in executive session because we've put out an RFP for a consultant. We've received one response back. And what this committee is tasked with from Management Council is making a recommendation on whether you want to move forward with hiring those consultants and having them produce a report for the legislature. And what that report will do is after it meets with everyone, and the two individuals who have submitted this report have extensive knowledge in program evaluation functions in other state legislatures. So they'll compare what they've done, what they've seen in other states, and how maybe that could work in Wyoming, how they think it could work. And so your recommendation then would be whether you want to move forward with hiring those consultants at this point in time to produce that report. And what that report will do is then help inform us on what we need to put into the legislative appropriation bill for this program, and then also any other changes to our statutes that maybe we need. And I would say right now, I mean, I think it's just fair to say it's not just the cost of this, of these consultants. It's likely $1 million a year for us to stand this program back up. And also the question of whether we can actually hire and retain people to do the program as well.
Okay, thank you, Director. Ms. Sharp, did you have anything you want to add?
No, Mr. Chairman, only the RFP that we did receive that I can discuss later, the specifics of it, but it would involve about almost 1,000 hours also of time, of the consultant's time, and meeting with legislators and stakeholders to see what they truly want, what they would want to see out of a committee, and to understand the Wyoming legislature and your needs and how a program of this sort could be built, and could be built very in a very small way. So for example, Florida has this program. They have a legislative auditor, but they have 50 people, and they have every sort of expert you can imagine on staff. So that's what these two consultants would be doing during this 1,000 hours of time.
Okay, thank you very much. So I maybe just to clarify for the committee, Management Audit Committee did not authorize this RFP. The previous Management Council did for the 66th legislature. So that this RFP was authorized, I think, December of last year or something like that. And obviously it takes time to go through the procurement process. So we were not the originators of it. We're not even the heirs of it. The current Management Council is, but we've been asked by Management Council to at least review, where we are, what's before us. One of the decisions I've made is because we were not the originators of it, is not to release that potential contract, because that is something that we get to review it, but we don't get to take any action on it. We get to make a recommendation. So that was my choice. And in consultation with the Director, Management Council, when they receive our recommendation, they can do whatever they like with, one, our recommendation, but two, with the information that they have requested. So that's why you'll note that we were asked to not share some information, and that one was the response from the contractor. If we had multiple contractors, it'd even be more potentially complicated, but even with just one, because the Management Council may say, oh, we need more responses, we're going to extend this time or whatever. So I don't want to taint their ability to do whatever they want with that contract. So that was my choice. Anything, Director? No? All right, so members of the committee, do you have any questions on kind of what the Director has presented so far? Senator Guru. You were a representative. That was the good old days. Thank you, Senator Guru.
The golden age, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, you articulated, and I was on appropriations when we hired Barry Dunn. That was the name of the outfit. Yeah, doing that study for ETS. And so overall, it appears, just from my vantage point, that with the expansion of these select committees during the interim, that they've kind of taken on a little bit more of that function of maybe not full-on program evaluation, but taking up, and we did it yesterday with one, and there are others out there that are taking on specific subjects, and that seems to be kind of the way the management council has drifted these subjects. So, I guess where I'm going with this is, I think there is a function of this, of having some program evaluators. The question is how, and it's more of a leadership question, in my view, than it is to us. Do they want to continue to keep it going that direction, or do they management council want to pull, take a conscious decision to pull that back and say, no, if you want a program evaluated, you send it here, because that's the statutory function of this part. That kind of the general gist of it.
Thank you. Director Obrecht.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Guru, yeah, I think that's right. And also I think that the distinction between a select committee or a task force and a true program evaluation, one of the key distinctions at least is a select committee actively learns and develops policy as they move through the interim process, taking testimony, receiving information from executive branch agencies, from other stakeholders, from LSO. A true program evaluation is you give the program evaluators that task, and then you don't hear anything until their report's done on it, 6 months, 9 months later. And I think that was one of the big rubs with this committee, with the full legislator, and with our program evaluation section. And it's a great thing if you've given yourself the ability to do other things, if you can do them both at the same time, and if you have a properly functioning program evaluation section. But with our limited resources we had, we could either staff the select committees or do program evaluations, but we really couldn't do both anymore. And I think that the legislature decided that those select committees was the format they wanted to go with more.
Thank you. Follow up, Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. So back to the Barry Dunn example. So an alternative would be hiring a specific consultant at another time and place by a select committee with the authorization of the management council to study, as we did with Barry Dunn. We hired so everybody knows, we hired a group to come in and take a look at ETS and how they were evaluating computer program asks from all the different departments, because at the time the committee was just besieged with multi-million-dollar requests from all different departments across the enterprise for new computer systems. And we had no way to evaluate which one was the most necessary. So we hired Barry Dunn to help ETS come through and do a system, an evaluation system, so they could give the committee the information they needed so we could prioritize how to spend the money. And like I said, when we were going through it, as a former member of this, a current member of this committee, I thought, yeah, this would be something that maybe we should have been doing. But at the time, that was the decision. And so would that be kind of the alternative to building a staff and standing up a whole research division at LSO?
Director Obrecht.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yep, that is for sure an option. And that is something that Lily and I have talked about, where her her staff, and the research staff will continue to grow. You know, right now it's Lily and Kelly and Pierre, and we're probably looking at hiring, well, we are actively trying to hire one more associate, and we'd like to hire 2 if we could. And they would manage those consultants for either this committee or for whatever committee hired them. And I think maybe you've also touched on another issue with the role of the Management Audit Committee historically is, how do I put this? We have each agency report to a specific joint interim committee, whether it be DEQ to minerals or health to the labor committee. And I think there was a bit of a turf battle within the legislature about the Management Audit Committee reviewing a program in one of those agencies where maybe the institutional knowledge about that in the legislative branch resided with another group. And so that's been another idea we've talked about, is if we move to a consultant focus or say some sort of program evaluation light where, you know, it's more in-depth research products or multiple stages of research products, is having that function then attach itself for a year or 2 years to whatever standing committee, whatever joint interim committee is reviewing that topic, rather than having this committee do a true evaluation on it.
Thank you very much. Representative Conrad.
Chairman Barlow, thank you. Question to the director specifically. Director Albright, you mentioned 75 reports had been done in the past. So with that question, or more importantly, with this question, are those 75 reports available publicly? And would this potential evaluation study, once it's completed or any manner of such, would it be also available to the public?
Director Obrecht.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Conrad, yes, by and large, the vast majority of the reports are public. I think there's only portions of some reports where we've used protected confidential information to develop whatever finding was necessary are still confidential. And if you retain these consultants, their report will be public as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Further questions for the director? Further questions for the director? Ms. Sharp?
And Mr. Chairman,
Please, Director.
maybe just one piece of information that I should really hit upon, and especially for the newer members of the committee that haven't been through an evaluation, is that these evaluations are not financial audits. We used to do that in LSO in the 70s, but we stopped in, I think, 1978. And that function has moved to the Public Funds Division within the Department of Audit in the executive branch. And you'll hear from them a little bit later this morning. But we haven't done a financial audit in LSO in over 40 years. If we wanted to, that's something you could explore through these consultants as well, but it would be a whole new function and require a level of expertise that we haven't possessed here in a long, long time.
Members of the committee, with that new information, are there any questions? Any questions? Right. Thank you. Is there anyone in the audience to testify on this topic? Anyone in the audience to testify on this topic? Is there anyone online, Kelly or Pierre, that on this topic? Okay. So you'll note that we have a potential executive session. The agenda was modified just a little bit. So if there's no questions, or we can have some initial discussion now, but we also have an executive session. And that executive session is actually for this committee to actually review or ask any questions about the RFP in the response to the RFP. As I mentioned, I didn't feel it was our place to release it publicly. That's for Management Council, since it's their request that's being responded to. So we can do that in executive session. There's no other reason to go to exec session except for that. And then if we, at the end of the day or after that, we can decide if we want to take any committee action. I think the committee action would be, recommend to proceed, recommend not to proceed, and then any other details you want. So, yeah, Vice Chair Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess we have a lot of new members on the committee. And so as I'm kind of looking here, I'm seeing maybe a little bit of glazed over look as to exactly what it is we're going after. And so I guess I would curious, the committee members that are new to the committee, if there's any questions broadly about the entire process that we've been talking about, because this has been kind of an ongoing process over the past 3 years. As I walked onto the committee 3 years ago, there was a lull, basically, where we didn't have a lot of information coming in. We were finishing up one program evaluation, and we were waiting for that, and the committee kind of got a little antsy, if you will, and wanted to start going after some additional topics and discussions, primarily, as the director stated, financial audits, and wanted to go after some of the financial auditing of some of the public agencies. And so there's been this kind of growing trend of what exactly this committee is tasked to do, as it is statutorily defined. But I would just ask to make sure that as we're going down through this process, if anybody does have any questions, now would definitely be the time to get into it and ask. And there's certainly not going to be any judgment on that, because my first 2 years on this committee was like drinking out of a fire hose. There was a lot of information coming forward. But if everybody's good, the chairman made mention we can move into the executive session and we can have the discussion on that. But I would say this is a pretty big statement and a pretty big motion for us to move forward on exactly what this committee would also like us to be doing and asking our staff to do as we move forward as well.
So I think maybe Senator Grew and I are the longest serving members on this committee. And part of what we did with this, and this was a discussion that happened with, I'll just give a little more background, a recent background that I can speak to. Director Obrecht encouraged the 3 previous presiding officers, or 6 presiding, 3 separate legislatures. We got to build some consistency into this committee, because this is a committee that these products take longer. It's not a lot of them are not one interim things. They're 2 or 3 years. And the other challenge is, and I don't know that this became clear with what the director said, is once we assign the topic, everything that occurs is confidential until there's actually a report released. And then we actually vote on releasing the report. Not everything gets released. Yeah, there are redactions. There may be entire reports that have not been released. I don't know that. Because we are really, this is and I think it's a powerful function for the legislative branch, but you've heard some of the logistical and the challenges we have. I think it's a powerful function, because we're really saying, is the policy that the legislature adopted being fulfilled? Not only from a fiduciary point, which we're not doing the financial part of it, but the policy, the real policy, and there's a process of doing that. A couple of years ago, we had a very large discussion about, what standards to adopt to do an audit, to do a public, and that was just, we had I think it was a very long discussion, maybe 2 different legislatures about, just what standards to adopt to do these audit functions. So, that's how important it was for some people to try to get it right. We're at a different place now. We have the standards adopted. The other thing that this committee has not had, and the director alluded to this, is folks that reported to us, assigned agencies until 2 or 3 years ago. And we were assigned ETS because they did not have a home committee and they don't like appropriations. I didn't say that out loud, did I? And ETS and A&I, because they didn't technically have a home committee as well. So for, I think, at least 2 legislatures, those committees have come to us for not our function as a audit committee, but as a standing committee, more traditional standing committee for policy considerations. You need a bill to change something that you're doing within your agency or such. So they would bring it to this committee. The current management council has eliminated that role, our interactions with those 2 agencies. So ETS and A&I are now, home committee is now appropriations. So that's a role we had for a bit, and now we no longer have it. So now the only interaction we have with I guess, formal interaction we have with a executive function is the Public Funds Division of our Department of Audit. And that goes to the question about, do we do financial audits? No, we don't. But we have some powers within statute of subpoena and things. If our colleagues in the executive branch of the Department of Audit are having challenges getting information or something, we actually have, in the past couple years, assisted, maybe, if you will, from the legislative perspective in getting cooperation and information on, maybe not on their behalf, but we've been able to be a part of that discussion at least and say, this is important. We all have an obligation to understand how public funds are being used. And while we don't directly oversee them, we certainly get those reports. All of you have been getting reports for different audits, and the division's going to come up here and talk about the cycle they go through audits and how often, et cetera. Well, you've seen some where there were some findings, correct? There were some challenges. Well, some of those things need to be addressed legislatively, potentially. So they would bring those things to us. We had several bills, 3 bills, I think, 2 years ago. I think Mr. Chavez, I think they'll tell us about. We had 3 bills that came out of this committee a couple of years ago that were just to the financial audit to help them do their jobs and help our communities and our special districts, et cetera, understand what their responsibilities are fiscally when it comes to their budgets, et cetera. So this committee still has a role, and maybe that role gets pushed somewhere else if this committee has a different makeup or whatever, but it still has a role, at least I think in that interaction, that I think is valuable. Regardless of whether we do something with a evaluation staff itself and staffing that up. Ms. Sharp?
Mr. Chairman, and that's correct, and that's one thing to add, is that even if irrespective of whether you go forward with this RFP, you still, as a committee, can assign, UN Management Council can assign topics to our research section to research for you. An example is the state lands topic, where we now have Kelly Lohr as our new state lands expert. So that is one thing that we can continue to do for the committee if you wish.
Thank you. With that, and thank you, Ms. Sharp. I added a little more context in the recent history. Yes, Senator Nethercott.
Just letting you know. Go ahead, you can complete your thought.
Nope,
Recent history.
I have nothing else to add. Thank you. Senator Nethercott, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I served on this committee early on in my legislative career, and I've heard these conversations now for 7 years. This is my proposal in the way that I prefer to communicate. I think that the purpose of the committee and the statutory purpose of the committee is fundamental and an important purpose of the legislature. However, in light of all of the circumstances of which we have been presented with, no meaningful work coming out of this committee for at least 7 years, I would move that we do a bill draft to suspend the work of the committee for a period of 5 years, and then a sunset date for either the repeal or termination of the committee, but requiring the legislature to reevaluate the purpose while not continuing to waste precious resources as we discuss the merits of the committee and not producing any result. So I don't see our desire for resources to change for supporting up an entire new division of LSO. I don't see us approving of outside consultants to come in and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for program evaluations. So I do think that a temporary suspension of the committee and a proposed repeal, forcing the legislature to re-look at this important purpose. And then in the meantime, as indicated, I think the purpose of the committee is important, but as the director has indicated, some of those purposes have been redistributed to both the select committees and the standing committees, where arguably some of those program audits are more appropriately placed due to the institutional knowledge associated with those committees, that we encourage them, and through management council and leadership, that all interim committee work through the standing committees considers as part of their interim topic a program evaluation. Not asking them to do one, because certainly we don't want to overwork LSO staff time, but as part of them determining what those interim topics are, and as legislators come up with ideas, that is part of their consideration for their work. That way we don't go years without a program evaluation consideration potentially, and it's kind of a safeguard. So that's my motion, long-winded, for the temporary suspension and proposed repeal.
And that is why we have bills in written form and amendments in written form. But thank you for that motion. Is everybody clear on what the motion is? If they are, then a second is in order. But is everybody clear on the motion? I think I'm just going to restate it as briefly as I can. A bill draft to suspend the committee, the statutorily suspended committee, for 5 years. We call it a sunset, but for 5 years. And then request that Management Council actually provide direction to interim committees to consider program evaluations through a consultant format for each as we go forward during that 5 years. Is that accurate? Does that summarize it?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I probably can more accurately summarize it. One, the bill draft, and so for clarity for the committee, this is just a bill draft to be considered at our next meeting. We can choose to kill it at that time, but signal to the public what we're doing and to our fellow legislators. So a motion to suspend for 5 years with the proposed sunset date in that bill draft for the repeal of the standing committee from statute. That's it. I don't think we would put in a bill draft for statute a direction to Management Council or a direction to the standing committees. We would just do that in a letter or some type of recommendation, but for purposes of a motion for a bill draft, it would have those two components in it, temporary suspension with a sunset.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second on the motion? Second, Representative Brown. Discussion on the motion. You want to discuss? You seconded it? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think I'll probably go ahead and vote in support of this just as the discussion to bring this on, because I do agree with the senator that there has been maybe a little bit of a lack of meaningful legislation or meaningful meetings that have come out of here over the past couple of years. However, I will say I do that skeptically. I'll be a little concerned about this as we move forward, but I do think it's maybe worth the idea of having this discussion, because we now have two options on the table. As we've brought forward, we've already run the RFP to have somebody come through, and we're going to be discussing what that RFP looks like and whether or not we hire this consultant is ultimately what we're trying to decide. So now we will have both options on the table. Pulling both of those options on whether or not we move forward is kind of where I have the heartache, I guess. I'm not sure where I'll fall on the bill, but I think having the bill draft for consideration is not a bad idea. So,
Further discussion? Further discussion on the motion? We have a little bit of feedback or noise. Representative Conrad, do you hear that on your end?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Representative,
Chairman.
go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I just got here. So I'll definitely listen to members that have been on the committee for years in their evaluation and judgment. But as I understand it, the Management Audit Committee should be and could be a very useful tool for other committees. As I look at it, the Management Audit Committee is it's a facilitating committee to both Management Council, other home committees, and to the legislature in general when in need of a task force or an evaluation of a program or compliance of a program. So maybe I'm looking at it just as a new member, but I would view this committee as very important to reduce the number of task forces that are created or to facilitate other home committees in their wish for a review on a certain agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Knapp. Anyone else? Representative Nyman, please.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess that would be my question. Is that the reasoning behind the need for more task force and special committee responsibilities, is because of the lack of movement on this committee? And you had mentioned, Matt, earlier there that there were some champions of this program in the early. Could you please describe when you said there were champions? I mean, exactly what was going on at that time when they were championing this committee, and what has changed evidently in that, and has that change exacerbated this desire or this need to create more task forces and less responsibility on this committee, which was evidently initially pretty heavy. And so if you could please clear that up for me.
So I'm going to make a comment first. I don't want to get the impression that the staff that we've had has not done a very good job in doing work on our behalf. And in my time, in the last 10 years, and my time on the committee in the last 6 years, we have had a staff. We're currently do not have a program evaluator, so I want to be clear, but we have had them. They have done good work. They have taken the direction of this committee. They have produced products. One of the things that we did probably about 3 years ago is we went from the full program evaluations to, I think we had 3 other documents that we did, white papers. We did some other shorter type of research documents just to answer basic questions. So then we could make the decision, do we want to go to a full-blown evaluation? So I want to be clear. It's not that we haven't had good staff who has accomplished what we've asked them to accomplish. We haven't gone through a full-blown audit since we just got done with one, and previous one was 2016. So full audits have been what's been. So we still have a motion on the floor. Could I get the director to speak to what Representative Nyman requested, and then we'll come back to the sponsor. Go ahead, Director.
Representative Nyman, I'm not quite sure what the transition was away from this committee. I think that really what I think is you as legislators now, throughout the last 50 years, have just been asked to make decisions on ever increasingly complicated topics that have more and more money attached to them all the time. And the tools that you had at your disposal within this committee, the program evaluations, through that evolution, I think members started to view those as not the best option to utilize in making their policy decisions, for a number of reasons, for how much time they took, for how complicated the programs were, and for the lack of legislator input through that process. So I think that may have been the reason why we saw a transition away from management audit and maybe to a more robust joint appropriations committee and to select committees and task forces, which always existed before. But definitely, we've produced that document where I think we've got since 98, the number of committee meeting days and number of task forces, and how that's grown so much during that time. So I think that's been the main reason for movement away from true program evaluations into task forces and select committee studies.
Thank you. Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think the answer and the reason why we're at this crossroads is just as a result of the natural change of how the legislature functions. So, we prefer task forces and the work of the standing committees as opposed to this one management audit committee. I also think probably it has to do with the people involved at the time. There's in our appendix a list of some of the legislators involved, pretty big, powerful legislators at the time. No offense to any of us, but that may not be the case. Right? So I think that the priorities of the people within the legislature changed, who set some of that directive or policy. So I think it was also used as a very blunt and powerful tool, this committee, by powerful legislators. Right now, where the state is, and I think where the legislature is, and has been for a decade or so, as we've seen this committee change, that's not the tool that the legislature uses anymore in order to keep a watchful eye on our executive and judicial branches. It's these other task forces and the standing committees and other mechanisms. And then I think so that's the historical observation that I've made. I know when I spoke to an older legislator, just as a side note, when I was first on the committee as a young legislator, it was raised eyebrows and wow, how amazing that you got on that committee such early in your career. And I had no idea. It didn't have the reputation it held then and doesn't do the work it evidently held then, or the need in the 80s when it was created in 90s. Those purposes no longer exist. So recognizing where we are now is that this is an ineffective committee based on the fact that we have task forces and standing committees who are doing a lot of this work. And more importantly, we don't have the resources. So LSO has told us time and again, you either fund LSO by a significant sum of money for the addition of potentially 6 to 10 more people, or if you don't do that, we have to hire consultants to the sum of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, of which we have no real purpose or mission to do, right? There's nothing that we're like, this is really important, we do this in front of us. So we either need to do the program properly and fund it properly, of which I don't sense that there's a desire right now for that because there's no pressing need for it, or we stop wasting the current resources we're putting into it for white papers and discussions and coming together to discuss the purpose of the committee over and over and over again. And that's why my motion is here. Let's suspend it. I anticipate there'll be a need for a powerful committee like this again. So instead of just outright repealing it, let's just suspend it temporarily until that need presents itself and the legislature is in a position to fund a significant sum, either directly within our own LSO or with consultants for a specific purpose, or we repeal it.
Thank you, Senator. And I think if I could, I'll give what I think the director and Ms. Sharp and I have discussed about what's analogous on the executive branch. It's an Office of Inspector General. That, when we talk about the power that this committee could have if it was utilized properly resourced, et cetera, Office of an Inspector General is, I guess, what I would call something analogous on the executive branch side. You think about that in different federal agencies, et cetera. We don't have any in the state of Wyoming, but federal agencies in many states have OIGs. So that's an analogous saying, a watchdog within the process, watching itself, and then in this case would be watching other branches of government, making sure policies are being carried out. So just a comparator to keep that, because you brought up the potential gravitas of this committee is real, and it has been real. Where we are now is a different place. Senator Grew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the motion. No, I'll vote in favor of the motion because I think it's worth the discussion. But going back to, just as a point of reference, for every dollar we spend on early childhood education, we save $7 per child per year when they get to kindergarten through 12th grade. I learned that from that report that we did many years ago. It still somehow rolls around in my head, which is why when I get to appropriations, I always really look one of the first things I look at is pre-K education and how we're funding it and what the funding level is. And we doubled it last year. I'm sure you all recall. So, a lot of great things have come from some of those reports. I also learned that as far as kids at risk, through a report done by this committee, that we have these silos of care for kids at risk. Some are in the court system and some are in the Department of Health, and they don't talk to each other very well because of legal ramifications and some of the problems. And that was one that we had a couple of years ago that we didn't get very far with because we just didn't know how to tackle it. But we've tried, and I know there's been some legislative attempts. And then I also explained how another committee just kind of took off on their own and went off to try to fix a problem that they saw with a certain committee or a certain health department. I too wonder sometimes about how we could do this. I think there is a role for this for this. I don't want to see it grow. I worry about, when I hear, millions of dollars for staff and 50 experts on everything running around this building. And, it's something I'm sure all of us kind of would question. So I think when I look and I look down to the good majority floor leader and I see committee chairs all around, and really look to my leadership to say, I support the motion and will support probably maybe taking this action, but look to leadership to say, what do you want us to do? How do you want us to, I think that's one of those questions that should be asked. I think there are, and whether it's housed down the hall on this floor or not, who does it, but I'll be interested to hear everybody weigh in. So,
All right, further discussion on the motion. On the motion, this motion did not include a recommendation on the response in the RFP, which is fine. We haven't discussed that, but this is just the bill draft on the 5 years. Further discussion? Further discussion. So this will be on the bill draft and then a recommendation or a notification to Management Council consider another means of assigning program evaluations. Further discussion? Further discussion? Seeing none. This is a bill draft. It's just a bill draft. So all those in favor of the bill draft motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
So I think it has been adopted, but let's just have a show of hands. All those in favor? Okay, 6 in favor, those opposed. It is adopted. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman?
Madam Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the alternative, since there are a number on the committee that just voted against that motion, which would suggest the support of the continuation of this committee, that we then do a recommendation to Management Council or perhaps a bill draft for the increased appropriation of 6 to 10 LSO staff members. Director, how many more people in order to stand up a program to meet the current needs?
Director Obrecht.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, great question, and that's kind of the purpose of the consultant, is find out what those needs are, what the legislature would like to do. Now, if we reverted back to our classic program evaluation, it would be 6 members, a manager and then 5 evaluators within that, which would probably be $750,000 a year at least.
Further discussion? Senator Nethercott?
$750,000 a year for 6 employees to stand the program up the way it was originally created when it worked effectively, without the need for an expert consultant to tell us that.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Knapp. Oh, it's the microphone.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So in that question, kind of relating to that question, there's 17 select committees and task forces now, 17. So what resources are those committees using, both in the terms of LSO and consultants? And I believe that would be part of the RFP. But as we've migrated from using this committee to more select committees, more task force, if you will, I think that cost also has shifted to those task force. I was just attended the Federal Natural Resources Management Committee last week, and it was almost a redundancy of TRW. And so I question in this migration where we've expanded task forces and select committees, if it didn't take the role of this, but also took on some of the costs, wouldn't you say?
Director Obrecht?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Knapp, oh yes, that's right. I mean, a growth in every new task force, new select committee requires LSO staff, and then also requires executive branch. And if it's like federal natural resource management, requires the federal government. Yesterday in the regulatory reduction task force, we heard from a grouut from Harvard that had analyzed the housing. Now, we didn't pay for that consultant, but the executive branch did. For us, here is really what happened. In 2015, the state was at a bust, kind of a micro bust, but it was severe, but short-lived. But LSO took, just like the executive branch, 15% cut during that time. We did that through vacancy savings, through not filling positions. But as I moved up through the leadership here, it became evident that where our growth was in our budget fiscal division. Probably a lot of different reasons for that, but we were absolutely killing our budget and fiscal staff at the time, which was 3 or 4 people. And I made that a priority because that seemed to be what the legislature wanted, and what leadership wanted was a robust budget fiscal division within LSO to help on those budget issues, revenue issues, Craig. So that division has now grown to 8 or 9 people. And while we've made back up that 15% cut with better times, salaries have increased, the number of staff here have increased modestly. That really is where our asset allocation has gone. Away from the program evaluation division, which legislatively and otherwise wasn't returning the same results that we were getting with our budget fiscal division. And that was a choice the leadership and I made.
Thank you. Jeanette, follow-ups? Any further questions? So there was not a motion in that. That was just a suggestion. So if there's no further discussion on this topic, we'll move on. Seeing no motions.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Nethercutt?
I don't think that this committee can do a bill draft. I don't think that's the appropriate mechanism to do a bill draft for the appropriation of 6 positions within LSO with an appropriation attached to it. I suppose we could. So that is my motion.
So now
creation.
It's not a good idea, but we're going to make the motion?
Well, I don't know that that's the best strategy as opposed to a recommendation to
Okay.
the Appropriations Committee or Management Council, but that's in fact what I'm going to do, is to do a bill draft. And so that is my motion, a bill draft which would be an amendment to this statute for the inclusion of at least 6 devoted LSO staff people to provide the necessary expertise for the effective purpose of the Management Audit Committee, and an appropriation of $750,000.
I'll second it.
Okay, so can we just include it in the last one so we have an automatic suspension of it immediately in the last bill draft? We can get it all done at one time? Just kidding, madam. Just kidding, Senator Nethercutt. So my question is, this is a bill draft to go statutorily. Is currently the way the budget works, it goes in the legislative budget bill, which is a management council product. So I just want to be clear, you want actually Green Book statute of establishing a 6-person program evaluation section in the Wyoming legislature to work on the behest of this committee. Is that accurate?
That is my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So there is a second. So for discussion on the motion, is everybody clear on the motion? Clear on the motion?
No, I need to.
You have a question or you need a
Clarification.
clarification? All right, thank you. Go ahead, Senator Guru.
Matt, well, I guess this committee is set up in statute. So is that where that motion would be, if that bill draft would be housed in that?
Director Obrecht.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator, yeah, I think we'd put it in Title 28, Article 8, within the management audit. And we talk about the program evaluation division within those statutes already.
Thank you.
And I would further say, it still has to go within the legislative budget bill, the funding part of it. Or go somewhere in the budget. How's that? Great. Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the senator bringing this forward, and I actually do believe this is the perfect committee. It's one of only 2 management committees in the entire legislature, so it's well within our prerogative. I believe that this is absolutely the mechanism to utilize, and I think this is a perfect complement to the other previous bill draft that we have one of 2 choices to make. We either put up or we shut up when it comes to doing our job. So I appreciate the senator bringing both the motions, and I'll support this one as well. Thank you.
Further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator Nethercott.
Representative Brown is correct. I mean, and the reason why I propose those motions and those bill drafts to be considered at our next meeting is we have 2 options. We either fund it or we don't. That's it. So that is the dilemma before us. I don't need a consultant to tell us that.
Okay, thank you. Further discussion? Further discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of the second bill draft, which would place in statute 6 employees to work at the behest on behalf of program evaluation. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Motion is adopted. Further motions on the topic? We might have got it all out. Do we want to wait and and decide how we want to recommend on the consultant issue? I know where Senator Nethercott is on it. Does the rest of the committee have, there's no doubt in anybody's mind where Senator Nethercott is. Does anybody else want to talk about that at this point, or just wait until maybe our executive session afterwards? Seeing no immediate desire, we'll move on. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Ms. Sharp. Next on our discussion is Department of Audit. And very pleased to have Mr. Chavez, Mr. Hanson, and several other folks here that actually do the work. I know how this works. They stay in the back and do the work. Anyway, it's great to see you all. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the relationship we've had over time. Look forward to your update, and thank you for the materials you provided already. Please proceed, Mr. Chavez.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Justin Chavez, Director of the Department of Audit. I have with me Mike Hanson, our Public Funds Division Administrator. I'll give a brief overview of the division and then let Mike give an update on the progress towards 2022 session House Bill 60 training bill. So the Public Funds Division is one of 5 divisions in the department. It is the division that deals with government entities, state and local level. The other divisions deal with private entities. So we're set up with 17 positions in the division, split across 2 sections, 2 primary focuses, with some staff that support the whole division. Our audits in the division, our statutory responsibilities are largely compliance-based, meaning that statute says, here's the requirement. We do an audit to see if the entities that we are auditing meet those requirements. I will draw a distinction from some earlier discussion. Although we do look at financial information when we do our audits, we do not do financial statement audits in which the objective is to express an opinion on financial statements in relation to GAAP. Any of the governmental entities that require those audits, those are contracted out to CPA firms. So the first section we have is the school finance section. That has an audit manager and 5 auditors. The primary objective of that section is to audit the data that school districts report that then goes into the funding model to determine how much state money the school districts get. So those audits consist of looking at whether that data reported is accurate and complies with statute. As part of that, we also have the responsibility to look at the Department of Education's process for collecting that data, managing that data, and managing the funding model.
Caught me I was in mid-sentence, took me off guard.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Justin, when you're doing the audits on the schools, you have 6 auditors, 5 and 1 audit manager. How do you guys determine what districts, or do you do all districts, all 48, or how do you guys do that, and how do you gather your information?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, please, Justin.
Representative Nyman. So we have a risk assessment process where we take different factors into consideration. So statute does require that we audit each school district within a 3-year period. So we set up a risk assessment that has factors such as how long it's been since their last audit, how many findings they have in their CPA audit, because school districts are all required to have a financial statement audit done by a CPA. So we'll look at the results of those. We look at prior findings. Since we've audited every district multiple times, we'll look at the prior time we audited them to look at, what kinds of issues, what magnitude. We look at changes in their reporting from what they were initially reporting to what their final reporting is, as well as surveying the Department of Education about their interactions with school districts. But ultimately, we audit every school district on a regular cycle. Yes.
Thank you very much. All right, please continue, Mr. Chavez.
Mr. Chairman. So we look at WDE's process for managing the funding model and its data. And then that statute also requires that we audit the systems that house the data that's reported for the funding model. So we have an IT auditor who looks at the IT controls over that data when we go out and do school district audits. The school section is a fairly narrowly focused section. It is just funding model components. Our other section that we have is our state and local government section with broader responsibilities. One of the main responsibilities is statutorily we have to produce the cost of government report on an annual basis. So that's a report that details revenues, expenditures, cash, and investments for different level governmental entities in the state. So to do that, we collect what we call census reports. They're basically financial reports that each government entity submits to us that has revenues, expenditures, cash, investments, as well as some follow-up paperwork depending on what their level of revenues and expenditures are. So we review that data, identify if there's any missing data, any issues with the data. We will then contact those entities to get that resolved. We compile all of that data and produce not only the cost of government report, which is a high-level statewide report, but then several more detailed reports for different level entities. So we have a report for the cost of cities and towns, a report for the cost of special districts. And so that process consumes about 4,000 hours of our staff's time on an annual basis. In addition to doing that, we audit a number of those entities. And so we're auditing those reports for the accuracy of those financial numbers and looking at related internal controls and then also additional statutory requirements. In addition to those audits, that section does some special request audits. So we may get a request from an entity, whether it be a state agency, whether it be a school district, to look at something specific. It may be construction expenditures, it may be grant funds. And so we do some of that. That division, or that section of the division, also is the one that gets tasked with assisting on fraud investigations. So typically each year we'll get a few requests either from law enforcement to assist on a fraud investigation, or we may get a concerned citizen that reaches out directly to us. And then occasionally through our own audits, we might identify fraud. And so we will assist in fraud investigations. There's a number of trust fund audits that are required by statute that section does. And then the division also manages the contract for the statewide audit. So the audit of the state's financials and then the state's single audit, we put out that RFP, we receive the bids, evaluate the proposals, make the selection, and then the cost of that audit is included in our funding. So that's a quick overview of what the division does. If there aren't any questions, I'll
Any
turn it
questions?
over.
We'll start with Representative Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. I'll keep trying to fight saying thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple curiosity questions, and maybe I should know this, but it just helps me better understand. In our last discussion here, we were talking about turnover. We were talking about attrition and how we're struggling to be able to keep people in the positions auditing. How much turnover do you have in your department? And how long, what is your most senior auditor and how much experience? Because when we're talking about complexity, that's, just in this discussion as we've talked about this, as this becomes more and more complex, it sounds to me like people get less and less enchanted about being auditors. So it's harder to keep them in the position. So my curiosity with you and with the financial work that you're doing, how much turnover do you have in your department? And what is the average length of time of an auditor staying with you and learning and having the experience necessary to provide these audits?
Director
Mr. Chairman.
Chavez, please.
Representative Nyman. So I'll say we are currently fully staffed in the division for the first time in probably 5 years. There was a point at which we were probably close to 50% turnover in the division. Most of our experience lies with management. Our auditors themselves, the most experienced one, our supervising auditor's been with us for probably 10 or 12 years. And then after that, it's probably about 5 years. We have a number of people that are in year 1 or year 2 of being with us. And generally, it takes probably 2 to 3 years to get a grasp or a handle on everything we do. If you look at like the school audit side, there is a lot of information that goes into the funding model, and a lot of that information isn't exactly straightforward. There's nuances to it, and so it just takes time to learn all of that. It's the same thing on our state and local section, where, for example, different special districts are subject to different requirements. They're not all subject to the same requirements, and so it just takes time to learn what applies to this special district versus this special district. So we have had some significant turnover, probably have a fairly new staff, but I think we're making progress in finally being fully staffed and keeping some people around. I think audit in general isn't everybody's cup of tea. Most people don't like auditors, so that can create some friction. We do have to travel a significant amount for our job, so a lot of times we'll lose auditors that will take an accounting position because it's a related field, but then they don't have to travel.
Please follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for my own edification here, when you were saying that it takes 4,000 hours to provide some of these audits, how many people does it take? What is an average number of hours an auditor provides in their job in the course of a year? Just so I understand. So at 4,000 hours, 2,000 hours, or whatever it is, and that percentage, so it's going to take 3 people to provide those 4,000 hours? Or 2, or how does that work?
Director
Mr. Chairman.
Chavez.
Representative Nyman. So we break it up at our census season runs technically from July 1 through the end of the year in terms of when those reports are coming up. But we have most of our state and local sections spend some time on that. So generally we have people who will be splitting time between receiving and processing and compiling those reports, as well as doing audits at the same time. So that section has 6 people And most of those 6 people, plus the audit manager, spend some amount of time on producing the cost of government report. In terms of audits themselves, they probably average, depending on the size of the entity, 500 to 1,000 hours. And so depending on the entity, we may have 2 auditors assigned to that. We may have additional auditors depending on the size of the entity.
I had Madam Sherwood, Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering if you could give us a brief update on House Bill 60, the section in your report under training, and just let us know how that process is going for you guys. Thank you.
So that is on the agenda, and they're going to get to it. Or it's part of their presentation, and they're going to get to it. He was going to punt it to his new administrator, I think. So she'll be patient. How's that? Any further questions on the overview of the audit function? Vice Chair Brown.
Thank you. Justin, just a quick question for you. You've mentioned that you're now staffed up to 100%. One of the issues that you guys had brought to us in the past was the availability of attracting auditors in general, and just the overall ability to attract that line of work, and you guys were struggling with that. My suspicion is a portion of it was to do with the pay raises that you guys have seen, and that you guys are actually marketable now compared to private industry. Is there anything else that you guys have been doing? And the reason I'm asking this is broadly looking at a management committee here. We certainly serve on other task forces and other committees where other agencies are struggling. And I'd just like to know if you guys have seen or done anything different. What's your magic sauce that's getting you guys to 100% and retaining those employees?
Director Chavez.
Mr. Chairman.
That was both a statement and a response. He's the new director of the division, so or the agency. So go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown. So I think we've tried to do a number of things. I think the recent raises have helped. We've tried to do things such as, because travel tends to be something that has contributed to our turnover, we've tried to get as much things as we can electronically recently and minimize our travel time. I think that's helped. We try to make use of flexible schedules, which I think helps, telework options. And I think just trying to create an environment where people buy into the work that we do. I think they tend to stick around if they think what we do is important, as opposed to just being there for a paycheck. And I think the vast majority of people that we have now think the work's important. So I think trying to create that environment has helped as well.
Thank you for this. Yes. Senator Furphy, good morning. Good to see you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm new to this committee, but how many exceptions are you finding? And are you actually saving money for our state? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chavez, please.
Senator Furphy. So the number of exceptions really does depend on the entity, and what our objective is. Some entities are better than others in terms of compliance. I'll say in terms of saving money, that's not really our statutory charge. Our statutory charge is compliance. I will say, so like on the school side, generally, historically, we've corrected about twice as much funding as what we've cost. But in general, our statutory charge isn't related to the efficiency or effectiveness type audits. It's geared just towards compliance and are they doing what they're supposed to be doing. I would say through our work and our training and education on internal controls, I think that has helped the entities that we audit become more efficient and be able to put better controls on their financial systems, which I think helps.
So just to bring some completeness, we had a banker asking an auditor a question using a term that maybe people don't use in everyday life, which is exceptions. So we just define what that means in the context of your both mutual understanding, but maybe not for the public and maybe not for some on this committee. Would you mind doing that, Director Chavez?
Sure, Chairman. An exception, it would be anything we identify that is essentially not compliant with a statutory requirement. In our terminology, in our reports, what you would see is we call that a finding. So a finding would be, here's what the statutory requirement is. You should be doing this. So an example would be statute requires that local government officials that have access to bank accounts be bonded. And so if we're auditing a town or a special district and their treasurer isn't bonded, then that would be an exception or a finding that statute requires this and this entity is not in compliance with that statute.
Thank you for that
Mr. Chairman,
clarification. Senator Nethercott.
curious you bring that topic up. Do you ever make recommendations to the legislature in response to concerns over whether or not, for example, a public entity is properly bonded based on the current times? For example, in the last legislative session, there was a bill to increase the bond amounts for some public offices as a result of inadequate bonding amounts. Obviously, if you are auditing that, you are aware of the legislature's failure to update those bond amounts for 100 years. Do you ever provide recommendations to the legislature based on those observations?
Director Chavez.
Senator Nethercott, I don't know that we've made a specific recommendation to the legislature. It would be in our audit reports, and all of them go to the committee, but I don't know that we have reached out specifically to the legislature, a member of the legislature, to say, hey, you might want to consider this.
So I would say as a follow-up, so we will be getting to House Bill 60, and that actually came out of the discussions we had in interactions with previous administrators saying, hey, we're having a challenge because our fiscal officers and those with fiduciary responsibility don't understand what their responsibilities are. So I don't know that it was a direct ask, but it was a conversation as we looked at these exceptions, findings, saying, how can we do a better job? How can we get folks understanding what their responsibility are fiscally? So I agree. Senator Nethercott. All right, I thought you were poised at the microphone there. Any other questions for Director Chavez? All right, I guess you're punting it over to your administrator. Go ahead, Mr. Hanson.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Michael Hanson, the Public Funds Administrator for the Department of Audit. As Representative Sherwood was asking, House Bill 60, the progress on that. So since that bill passed and went into law for Statute 91510, we started trying to figure out, over the year, how we're going to implement that and track those certifications.
Would you just summarize what it is? Because House Bill 60, there's one every year.
Yes.
So,
sorry. So
would you just summarize what that particular House Bill 60 is,
yes,
please?
So the law that got passed into statute as 91510, right, is public officer training requirements, which basically established the Department of Audit as being responsible for either training the public officers of the state that are responsible for public fund accounts, or in lieu of that, authorizing other trainings that would qualify. And so when we started working on it, does that help answer the question? Okay.
Please proceed.
As that was passed, we started working on and setting up a committee of auditors within our division to, one, create training, but first we had to set up requirements, right? So we had to say, okay, what are the trainings going to require in order to allow other entities to request us to approve them? So we set out a list of 12 requirements that are actually on our website, starting with the functions of the members of public office. So whether it be a board member or a council member for a city or town, or mayor, clerk, all those types of things, going through, what are effective internal controls and how to use those. We talk about bonding, we cover that in our training. Trying to think of several other things, public meetings, what's required of a public meeting. So these are, types of like the basic things that I feel like every public officer should be aware of in order to effectively govern or run an entity, public funds. So starting with that, we created the list of items that are required, and then promulgated rules in Chapter 10, which went into effect January 4th of this year. Right? Yeah. January 4th of this year, which then lay out how entities and public officers can obtain their training, either request a waiver, and then how other organizations such as Wyoming Association of Municipalities, Special Districts, Wyoming Special District Association, like how they can provide training to their members, essentially. And so we've received a number of self-assessments from those entities that are offering trainings, and have been able to approve 3 of those, in addition to us developing our own training that we intend to implement and put on, I think, sometime in August. So we want to offer training that is cost effective for entities. So we can do it virtually, we can do it free down here in the amphitheater in the Capitol, or allow these other entities or organizations to put on trainings that cover these topics. So, beyond that, we've developed a system for tracking when public officers receive their training. So requiring them to submit to us certification or an affidavit certifying that they have taken one of the approved trainings that we have on our website. I think that the trick there, or the tricky part of that, is knowing every, say, board member or councilman for every city and town. So trying to figure that out is what we're working on right now. But basically going through when special districts are pretty easy because they submit a budget to us every year as required by statute, and they're required to then list their board members and governing body. So that's very helpful.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Yep. Let's see, there's something to follow up with, and then we'll take questions. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just wanted to give a little more background on what led up to this. And so in discussions with this committee, what we were seeing in our audits were those responsible for completing the reports didn't always have a solid grasp of internal controls or what the requirements were for submitting the reports, how to fill them out, what goes where. And we're also identifying that a lot of governing bodies that should be a control over some of this didn't necessarily know what their responsibilities were in relation to the reporting. And we were seeing that in a number of audits. And so in discussions with this committee, that kind of led to well, what do we think would address that situation? And that's kind of what led to House Bill 60, in which we're tasked with setting minimum training requirements for those who manage their funds for the government entity, as well as those governing bodies.
Thank you. And that was a direct result, to Senator Nethercott's earlier, of discussing findings, going through these documents, these audits, and saying all these findings are pointing to this, this, and this, and how do we improve that? Training was one of those first steps. Let's make sure people actually understand what their responsibilities are. Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. This sounds really good that the entities are getting the training and things like that, but I have a couple questions, and then I'm sure that'll cover it. Number one, why hadn't this been done all along? I mean, there's lots of special districts and different things. Number two, what is the compliance mechanism if they don't comply? with the different things? And number three, do the irrigation districts come within your purview of authority? And number four, if they don't, let me see, so some of the districts are very, very small, report for a meeting occasionally, da-da-da. So is it going to be part of the training for them to peruse the websites consistently? Because that's not something your normal people do. People tell me that, well, it's on our website. Well, there's lots of websites for lots of different things. So I'm just kind of wondering what the mechanism is and what the follow-up is and what is the consequence if it's not followed. Thank you.
Correct.
I can take
They're
a stab
drawing
and
straws on
wanna
who's
add.
going to take this
Yeah.
question.
Mr. Chairman,
All right, Director
Representative
Chavez.
Ottman, I'll start. So in terms of why it hasn't been done all along, I think there's a number of entities that have historically provided training, us being one of them, but there was never any requirement for it. And so I think participation in those trainings could be spotty. And I think there was a correlation with those that didn't attend the trainings were also the ones we would see issues with when we would do our audits. So it was never required. Why it was never required, I can't speak to that, but it was never a statutory requirement. It was kind of an optional. And so it was left to those entities in terms of essentially hiring or attempting to hire people who were knowledgeable in these areas. We do have a lot of special districts where, it's volunteers. And so, they may not have an ideal background and they're kind of learning along the way. And so that's part of our process as well, is when we get the reports to try to help them through that process and give them some training along the way. In terms of if they're not compliant, a couple of things. Statute does give the director the authority to request removal of any official that's not compliant. The second, maybe sub-effect, if you will, is if you're not compliant, there's probably more likelihood that you're not compliant with the reporting requirements, and non-compliance with the reporting requirements can then result in funds being withheld from the entity until they are in compliance. And then as far as a control mechanism, we have set up a tracking process for tracking who has met the training requirements. And then in addition, if we identify, if you've done the training, but then there is still issues, say with your census report, or we do an audit and there's significant issues, we can require additional training.
Okay, and I think there was a question about irrigation districts.
Oh, irrigation
very
districts.
specifically. Thank you.
So they do, irrigation districts do fall under our purview in terms of a requirement to submit their census report to us. In other words, their financial report to us. If they're large enough to require a CPA report, that will come to us. We have the ability to basically grant a waiver to those entities because they fall under the supervision of the court system, but provided they have provided appropriate documentation to the court system, they then don't have to duplicate it to us. But for the purposes of the census report, they do have to report to us. And we can audit them if they're not getting a CPA report or a CPA review. So in general, the population of entities that we audit is left to those that don't get some other type of audit. Because statute does require, based off of revenue and expenditure level or type of entity, that you get a CPA audit. So all counties, all first-class cities, and then any town that has opted to be a first-class city have to have a CPA report. All hospital districts have to have a CPA audit. And then any special district whose revenues or expenditures exceed $1 million a year have to have a CPA report.
And Director, just to be clear, there's that level, then there's the review, and then there's a couple other levels, and that's where you would interact with an audit. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman,
Financial audit.
yes. So from $500,000 to $1 million, they have to have a CPA review. $1 million and up is a CPA audit. And so those entities, we don't duplicate that effort and do audits. Below that, there's different requirements based on revenue and expenditure level in terms of what additional paperwork is required beyond just the census report. So if you're below 25,000, it's the census report. 25 to 100 is a census report and a proof of cash. 100 to 500 is then includes a self-assessment or a self-audit. But anything below $500,000 is what we would potentially audit.
And to be clear, there are carve-outs for certain types of special districts as well. I mean, there's certain districts fall differently even within that structure, if I remember right, fire districts being one of them. And we had that bill a couple of years ago. So there are nuances even within the structure we have. So there's a follow-up, please, Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all of that information. That's very good. Just another point of clarification for me. Number one, what does a census look like? And number two, when you say they could be under you or they could be under the court, what does that mean?
So another definition of term, our term of art, and then the court issue on the irrigation district. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ottman. So when we say census report, that's just the financial report that each local government entity is required to submit to us. And so it just has a breakdown of revenues by type. So tax revenues, charges for services, stuff like that. And then expenditures by type. And then cash and investment information. So it's basic financial information that gets reported to us. In terms of the court system, and I'll take a stab at if I've got everybody, but essentially water and irrigation districts statute puts them under, their oversight is under the Supreme Court rather than us. And so they are kind of separate in terms of they have to provide, say, a budget to us, but it doesn't have to be the budget form that we require of everybody else. So it's more the court system is tasked with overseeing their function rather than us overseeing it like we would other special districts.
Another nuance in statute. Any further discussions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Nethercott.
Thank you. Really two questions and then one point of discussion about why was this not always done. You know, my view is that it is a local control issue, right? Most of these special districts or local government entities have their own elected people on them and that are created by the local community through a petition for such an action or the creation of such a district, whether it be a water district or an irrigation district. And so what we did with House Bill 60, I think, was really a good thing. But it was the state control over local governing bodies that is what could be argued as bureaucratic red tape, right? Of now you have to go through this training by another government entity, this bureaucracy, this additional requirement that gets in the way of the purpose of the mission, right? It could be argued that way. And so it's important to recognize how sometimes how those ideologies can interfere with the efficient operation of government and criminal activity, quite frankly. From my anecdotal observation, I mean, the reason why House Bill 60 came into existence was my anecdotal observation, and that we were seeing a lot of special districts having its employees being convicted of embezzlement of those public funds or some other type of gross mismanagement of those funds throughout rural Wyoming. And many of these fire districts, which is how their statute came to be different, district courts. And so curious to know your answer as to, is my anecdotal observation correct, based on your knowledge that Wyoming has historically experienced a greater number of these types of convictions associated with the misuse of public funds by employees of government entities, one. And then two, can you walk me through kind of the implementation of House Bill 60? How did all of these government entities become aware of this bill and it becoming law that they have to get the training? And then I would like you to provide us a list of those who are not currently in compliance with the training.
Mr. Chairman.
Start wherever you'd like.
Senator Nethercott. I think we have worked on a number of embezzlement cases at all levels of government. And then there are others where we don't have any involvement, but are still embezzlement cases. So whether or not that is more or less compared to other states, I couldn't really say. But we have worked on, we typically work on probably, it's been 3 or 4 a year over the last several years. And that's, like I say, just the ones we work on. Sometimes either DCI or local law enforcement are able to handle that without our assistance. At least a few a year on our part, and then others in addition to that.
Mr. Chairman, can I just respond?
Please follow up on that.
Quickly, thank you. That seems like a lot to me. I mean, for intentional criminal activity to be occurring, you're involved in, your expertise is required in 3 to 4 of those investigations for our government entities. What could we be doing differently in order to prevent that? Clearly auditing isn't working.
Director Chavez.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, I'll say a couple of things. Usually, the cause, if you will, is a lack of internal controls. And so we try to educate entities on internal controls, but really when it comes down to it, it's that governing body that is responsible for ensuring that those internal controls exist and are operating effectively. When we come in and audit, we'll identify whether controls are in place and whether or not they're working, but our 6 people are responsible for hundreds of entities. And so the reality is that the vast majority of those entities don't get audited. We just don't have the manpower to get to them to be able to identify those. So it's really on the governing body to make sure that they understand what controls should be in place and to ensure that they're working properly.
They're in House Bill
So
60.
I give you, examples. So typically what happens, and I'll say most of what we see aren't complex frauds. It's just because one person has access to do too many things without anybody looking at it. And so, recent example is a clerk that was responsible for taking in money, recording it, doing the reconciliations, and making the deposit. No one else was looking at anything. So that person takes cash, and where all it would have taken is a simple reconciliation between the accounting system and the bank account to say, hey, money's missing. But that person that was taking it was the one responsible for doing that function. And so I think in most of our cases, there's just not proper internal controls. There's nobody else looking at what an individual is doing. We don't see too many cases where it's a complex fraud in terms of, say, altering documents or anything like that. It is just one person's responsible for doing more than they should be doing financially.
Thank you. I think there was a couple other questions in the original one. Do you want to re-ask any of those, or?
House Bill 60, how were all the government entities informed of this statutory change? And then, I don't expect you to know this, but will you provide the committee a list of those entities that are not in compliance, even though it's early? And still curious to know that. And then a general question I'm going to throw out there while I have the mic. I don't anticipate you to know this either, but maybe LSO can find out for us with your assistance, which is an estimation of the total amount of public funds embezzled by government employees in the state of Wyoming for the last 10 years.
So I'll speak a little bit to the development of House Bill 60. There were actually a couple other bills. That was a collaborative process. The associations were in the room, WAMCAT and all those folks were in the room and providing testimony and working through that bill process. It might have been even a two interim process. So anyway, Mr. Chavez.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, the way that the entities are being informed is, well, when we send out friendly reminders, so to speak, like postcards, letters, emails. We also rely on the organizations that the chairman alluded to earlier, WAM, WAMCAT, special districts, conservation districts. They're in communication with all their members frequently. And so we are in communication with them as far as what's coming down the road for the requirements for the public officer training. As far as the number that are in compliance or out of compliance, and I should have mentioned this probably when going over the overview of the progress. So the statute actually takes effect July 1st of this year, and then they have, the entities, the public officers themselves have 1 full year to become compliant, which is why we haven't put on a training yet, and we'll be doing that in August. There are actually 3 very motivated people who have become compliant already, though.
And then, Mr. Chairman,
please,
Senator Nethercott, I'll speak to the amount of money that's been embezzled. Off the top of my head, I can't give a number. The tricky part about that is what is identified and what is convicted or made to pay restitution is generally or could be drastically different numbers. So what I think what we could probably give you is what we're aware of in terms of what has gone all the way through a conviction and what was ordered to be repaid. But I would say that's probably a number that is far less than what is actually being embezzled. Like I say, one, because that amount tends to be lower than what we or DCI or local law enforcement identify. And then I would speculate that we also don't identify everything. That's kind of the nature of fraud, is that if it's concealed, there may be more than what we're able to identify. But we could probably try to round up what's been convicted over the last 10 years.
Very good, thank you. Further questions? Representative Knapp.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I know we offer required training in our county. When you do your general training, will you also be proactive in providing, say, GASB changes that could affect a potential audit that upcoming year? Will you keep people informed of potential changes coming up?
Mr. Chairman,
Director.
Representative Knapp. So in terms of GASB changes, so I'd say the vast majority of entities that report to us report on a cash basis. And so they're not reporting in compliance with GAAP or GASB statements. I believe the state auditor's office does provide training on issues related to GAAP and upcoming GASB pronouncements. If they're an entity that's required to get a CPA report, the CPA firm that's doing it would also have some involvement there.
Further questions? Further questions? So I think if you want to see an example of both these internal controls, take a look at that water and sewer district, one that was provided to us about 2 weeks ago that had numerous findings. And I think they're findings that you would argue it's just compliance with state law, that they were not complying with state law. I don't know if there was any fraud or anything occurring in that. I don't believe there probably was, but it was just unknowing, or smaller districts just don't have that complexity, but they are still using public funds. They are still taking money and providing services with public's money. So I think that one served as an example of, we went through all this and we still have folks that, and actually this other thing to keep in mind is those audits are based on books that are 3 or 4 years old. So hopefully they're getting up to speed. So we're looking backwards quite a ways in time. I think those were actually the books were 3 years old when that audit came about. So anyway, so just keep that in mind. Hopefully things are improving and we're not. And then the rollout on this House Bill 60, hopefully we've given enough time for people to actually become compliant. And my understanding, it's a once in a lifetime training. Once you've had it and you stay on city council for 12 years, it's not like attorneys need LE and other people need continuing education. It's a one and done type thing. That's the way it's structured currently. Is that accurate, Mr. Hanson?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
There you go.
It does offer, our rules offer the ability for us to, if compliance were to fall off, like with census reporting, all that kind of stuff, that we can require them to take it again through Section 7 of Chapter 10. But yeah, the meeting is once per lifetime.
Just basic level of understanding, and then Representative Altman, then it'll be Senator Endicott. Representative Altman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question that occurred to me. We were talking about WHAM telling and keeping their members up to date, and they do a wonderful job. But I was wondering and going back to the irrigation districts, who is that? Is that the district water person, or who is it that's over these districts to encourage them to be in compliance or know what their issues are?
Director Chavez, if you know. Or Mr. Henson.
So, Mr. Chairman, so if I understand the correction or the question correctly, so who within the water district?
No, is there an association over water districts similar to municipalities,
Gotcha.
conservation districts, et cetera? Is there someone that they lean on for that type of association education? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, my understanding that would be the Special District Association, right?
Could be the Special District Association in
Director.
general. There are other associations like Rural Water Association. And so I believe they would assist in helping with that requirement.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Further questions? Let's see, check the agenda. Check your script. Anything else? Gentlemen, do you have any requests for this committee, since that was of interest to one of our members? Is there anything that you've seen or think needs to be, one, modified with Senate file or House Bill 60, or anything else you're seeing that would be of assistance in your carrying out your functions on behalf of citizens of Wyoming?
Mr. Chairman, so I guess with House Bill 60, it would be hard to tell at this point because it's going to take, I would imagine, a year or two to find out how many entities and governing body members and public officers are going to be compliant. I would say, wanted to add that, over the last 3 years, we've been conducting follow-up reviews. So once we do an audit, the next year we'll pick 2 or 3 entities to go review, see how many findings they've corrected. So the first 2 years, it was somewhere around 42%. And last year, the 3 follow-up reviews that we did, it was like 81% of the findings had been addressed partially. We were making progress toward corrective action. So I'm not sure if that has anything to do with the implementation of House Bill 60 or other actions that this committee has taken over the last couple of years, but I'm hoping, that through those follow-ups and then also the compliance tracking that we'll be able to provide you with more pertinent feedback. The one question, I guess that I do have from, is 91507J, which was House Bill 56 in 22, I believe, that required entities to become compliant by September 30th for financial reporting. And then if they weren't compliant by September 30th, then by October 5th, the Department of Audit would certify non-compliant entities to the state auditor's office. And at such time, then funding, which would be loans and grants, is to be withheld. So the last year was the first year of that implementation. And it left, the statute basically leaves up to the agencies that are supplying those loans and grant funds to withhold those. So really what that resulted in was a lot of questions for us about what that was supposed to mean. So what was the intention, I guess some clarification maybe on what the intention of what state loans and grants would be. Just my concern is I would want consistent implementation across agencies instead of agencies making their own determination on that.
So are there examples where different agencies, so I just got to clarify, are there examples where different agencies were applying it differently or not reporting it different or not querying you or the state auditor actually is where you report to? So give me if you want consistency, I have to know where the inconsistency lies if we're going to try to address it. If it needs to be addressed statutorily, or is it something that needs to be done in the executive branch?
Right. Mr. Chairman, the questions that were coming were more of what constitutes loans and grants, tax funds. Is this just for SLIB? Is it loans from SLIB? Is it something else like that? It was just questions that I didn't view as necessarily my or our role to interpret that answer, and so that was the.
Okay, so I think on that, instead of us trying to surmise what House Bill 56 did or not, maybe what I'm going to request is you visit with our staff, get with Lily, and just point out the pertinent part of statute, and maybe it's a definitional issue that we need to either, maybe it's already there somewhere else in statute, what a loan or grant is, or however, but maybe we have that conversation first in an informal, or that setting, and then if there's a question still, then I think we bring it to the next meeting. We have 2 more meetings scheduled, and we have the option of having more if we need to. And if there's some clarification needed, we'll work on that. And does anybody, committee, have any different approach to that? I think let's make sure we're all on the same page with our staff and what the concern may be, and then let's see if we can find a way forward. Anything else from the committee or Department of Audit, Public Funds Division? Thank you for all your work. Is there anyone online yet, Kelly? I was expecting Ms. Johnson to be online. She's with WAMCAT, Association of Municipal Clerks and Treasurers, one of those organizations we were talking about earlier, WAMCAT. They have a fun name at least, WAMCAT, but no one's on there. And what about Kelly Myler? Nobody. Are we online? Are we actually online? Is anybody in the room wants to testify on this topic? Yes, sir. Come forward. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. And don't go anywhere. Maybe we'll have a follow-up question after this gentleman.
Sure.
Or you can leave those seats if you want, if you don't want to be in the firing line. Not that you're coming into the firing line. Good morning. Welcome. Please introduce yourself and provide your testimony. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Justin Schilling, Member Services Manager with the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. Just wanted to come and give an update on our efforts when it comes to the reporting or the public funds manager requirement, training requirement. We hosted staff from the Department of Audit at 2 events, both our finance director's workshop, which was last fall in Jackson, as well as the winter conference that we host here in Cheyenne. This one was in January and coincides with the legislative session. As they were promulgating rules and deciding what those bullet points were going to be, those kind of core concepts for their training, we were working on our end to hopefully design a curriculum that would fulfill those concepts. In January at our winter conference event, by coincidence, we also held what we called a newly electeds boot camp for our newly elected officials from this last general election. We had a little over 100 folks that participated in that boot camp. It was 6 hours of training on kind of our core meat and potatoes concepts, for lack of better terminology: open meetings law, public records, ethics and conflicts of interest, conduct of elected officials. We touch on social media and to stay off of it, economic and community. I don't know.
How's that working? Just saying.
At all levels of government, it's training that could be continued, I think. I guess I'll say that. Those folks, and what we realized coming out of that event and in our conversations with Department of Audit, is that a vast majority of what they were asking for bullet point wise had been covered in that newly electeds boot camp. So we provided all the curriculum from that and then proposed a supplemental that would get us the rest of the way there, what we felt was the rest of the way there. We received positive affirmation that our curriculum was sufficient for the training requirement. Back on the 2nd of May, we kind of shifted into high gear. At that point, we have our summer convention was planned for the 7th, 8th, and 9th in Cody. We just got back from that. But basically what we let our members know at that was, and the way we structured it, is anybody that had done the boot camp in January could come to Cody and just take the 90-minute supplemental and be done. Or folks that had missed the boot camp, because we had marketed it as a newly electeds event as opposed to a everybody event, we also provided then the boot camp in Cody. We split it up. We did a little differently. It had been a 6-hour haul the first time that we did it. I guess one thing to interject here too is that we've offered this training at no cost to our members. So the boot camp that we did in January, normally with our events, there's a registration fee that's involved, and there's meals and there's other activities that are included for that registration fee. But because we felt this training was so important, we offered it gratis to anybody who's a member community in our organization, which is 98 of the 99 are. So we broke it up so that we had 2 3-hour sections, just to save on people's patience and comfort. That was some of the feedback we got after the January event. We knew we were adding an extra hour and a half, 7.5 hours, a long time to sit anywhere. You guys know that, having done it in the legislature. So as of today, we're finalizing those records to send those into Department of Audit, but we're at 167 individuals that have basically been through the entire training curriculum. Our math is that we're a little over 600 individuals that we're responsible for as the Wyoming Association of Municipalities, if you're counting council members and mayors. Obviously, WAMCAT's looking at clerk treasurers and treasurers, but we're focusing on those elected officials. And our training is a little broader than just what's required in those bullet points. I will say thank you a little bit. Participation in our events has been great with this mandated training, as folks know they need to get it done. We had 239 people registered for this event in Cody. Obviously, not all of them needed the training, but that's a good number for us at one of our events. So, and we feel like with this, with the addition of this, with the boot camp material, that we're delivering, a more fleshed out and better training product to these municipal elected officials. I will say that there's a very interesting level of pushback when it comes to the training. To Senator Nethercott's point, there's a certain number of members of our constituency, I guess you would say, that participate in government but don't like government. So there's a certain amount of pushback of, I won't do what I'm told. So we're working through that. We're doing that more as a sales job right now and trying to sell the quality and the value of the training so that we can work through getting the rest of these folks through. I'd hoped to be a little closer to a third done. We fell short of that a little bit, obviously, but so now that we've been through these live events, our next live event will be our winter conference again in February. Between now and then, by the end of this summer, we'll have an online option available, which will be the same training broken up into modules. Folks will be able to watch those trainings online. Right now, the one big discussion we're working on is the length of those modules, whether they'll be hour-long or half-hour-long modules. And at the end of each one of those, there'll be a short quiz for people to take. And then once they've completed that quiz, that scoring will come back to me so that we can then build out that roster and basically track those folks that have finished the program. We're not providing quizzing at the live events, but we just want to make sure, and as an extra added safeguard, that those folks aren't just turning it on and going to wash the dishes or, going about their day while their computer's playing 8 hours of fiscal training. So, we did try to add in a little extra safeguard. We do think it's critical training. That's one of the reasons that we participated in the discussion as this bill was being crafted. We didn't mount any kind of opposition to it during the legislative process. Because we do feel like folks should know this. The one interesting pushback that we've gotten, and of course in small town Wyoming, things are a little bit different. A lot of your local elected officials are appointed. They might not have a candidate for a particular ward seat. So a lot of people kind of get voluntold into these positions. So then when they get told, oh yeah, and you've got to go for this. Sometimes that's a little harder sell than the folks that actually have sought that office. But we're trying to basically sell the point that one business day worth of training, when it's not just the fiscal training either, we're packaging other things that hopefully will help them be good at their jobs, that's well worth it. There's very few jobs that you can get where there isn't a day's worth of videos or whatever else that you might be called on to consume to do that job. And we think, being in charge of public money, public budgets, the public good, that it's well worth that 1 day's worth of training. I will say that there is a certain amount of confusion as to who all this applies to. I think to Representative Ottman's question a little bit about the water districts, I've had a lot of our folks carry a lot of water, and not to steal that, but within their communities, they may sit on different boards, or at least they're in communication with those folks. And obviously WAM's very fleshed out. We're very good at training. It's one of the main things that we do. WAMCAT, very similarly, the County Commissioners Association. But I think there's a certain amount of question out there as to, well, does this apply to? And I think that feels a little amoebus to a lot of folks. So maybe some extra clarity on that would be good, especially given the fact that we're basically coming up on 12 months. 12 months to deadline. So it's rapidly approaching. When this first passed, it felt like we had a lot of time and a lot of runway. That runway is getting shorter all the time. So that might be one piece of feedback that I would give. We're certainly going to press on. But what I've pledged to my members is that we'll keep a an accessible spreadsheet, basically, for them that'll show the folks within their community that have passed the training. A twofold purpose, one just for, keeping tabs and record keeping on their part, but also maybe a little friendly peer pressure when folks don't see their names appearing on that list and everybody else maybe on their councils is. I know there's been discussions amongst our members about the compliance and what punitive action there might be taken if they have folks that just outright refuse to participate. What I've told folks is that I think, in rule, obviously, with what happened with the deadline change and those sorts of things, with Department of Audit, where all those grants and other funds were frozen, that was a bit of a hair on fire panic amongst a lot of my members. And interestingly enough, a lot of that list, when I got that list from the state auditor's office and everybody was scrambling to figure out, kind of the fix or how to get past that, when I looked at that list, I was a little perplexed because it was a lot of I call them my gold star kids, right? The entities and the towns that are always on it, that are always in early, that don't have ongoing issues. So I was like, how are they on this list? And I think, what we came to in discussing it with them and follow-up conversations was just some shortfalls in communication. Of those, I know WAMCAT really tried to get the word out, but not everybody participates in WAMCAT. Not every single town's clerk treasurer is a member of that. It's a voluntary membership. So with some of these entities, I just feel like when it falls to us or it falls to WAMCAT, yes, we do as good a job as we possibly can of getting the word out to our memberships. But I feel like those entities that either don't participate, that would be where our members, but just don't, like Rock Springs, or, obviously in smaller associations for other types of entities, there might be some stopgaps there. There might be some folks that fall through the cracks a little bit, and that this could get hard in that last 6 months or whenever they find out about it. And then suddenly there's a bit of a panic to get caught up and get people through. So with that, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you. So I just want to be clear or bring a little context. We had an offering, education, and carrots, and then there was a stick, because compliance was what we were trying to get to based on some of the things that we had seen. So my question is, there was no action taken this last time on folks who weren't compliant. Is that accurate? Or were there entities that did not receive grants or loans in this last? I don't think that is actually in effect yet, or is it in effect? It is in effect. So if you don't know, we'll get the division back up. Who went without or had to rectify something, which they can rectify their census reports and all that. So any of your members fall into that category where they went without for a bit of time, or not because they were non-compliant?
My understanding is that, that funding was paused. I think for most entities, the fix was simple enough.
Right.
I know with a lot of them, it had to do with an attachment letter to whoever they were going to use as an auditor, and a change in kind of the rules surrounding that. That was the one that tripped up, again, kind of my Audit communities the most, was that little change within that auditor attachment statement. So that was the kind of thing that once they were in touch with Department of Audit, they were able to get rectified fairly quickly, a day or two kind of thing. It was they weren't way out of compliance. It was just a short trip up, so.
Thank you. Senator Nethercott, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just want to say thanks for you being here today. Obviously, you were the only public entity represented, WAM, so the Association of Municipalities. And thank you for taking leadership on it and providing that training and being a facilitator of the legislature's intent. Certainly appreciate it and appreciate your presence here this morning.
Thank you.
So on that note, as you know, we have a requirement within our committee meetings that you have to sign up to testify the day before 5 p.m. So there are other folks that, for whatever reason, didn't get signed up who are going to testify, but they're not available, and we're not going to worry about it this time. But unless somebody's come online since then. Any further questions for Mr. Schilling? Further questions? Thank you very much. Oh, go ahead. You have something follow up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I would mention is we've had other entities ask about, because we are one of the few that's up and running, and with this online option that we've got coming by end of summer, we've had other entities ask, folks, hey, we've got this special district in our community, can they take your training? Our training is a little more robust than they need to fulfill this requirement, and it's also skewed and obviously tailored for our municipal elected officials. I think we would be willing, to broaden our delivery to other folks. The one thing I get, the one bit of guidance that I guess I would look for, whether it was from Department of Audit or this committee, perhaps would be the fiscal part of that. Obviously, we're delivering this training to our membership and kind of in lieu of the fact that they're dues paying members to our association. I think we would be open to, providing the training to other groups, but kind of with the understanding that our members wouldn't be footing the bill for the administration, because we've spent several $1,000s on the development of the curriculum with our outside training consultant. We'll spend several $1,000s more in putting together the remainder of this online training. And then we'll have, while this really is one big elephant barbecue to begin with, because we're getting all of our members through, then we suspect that it's going to be 60 to 70 people every couple of years, as you then have turnover and new folks come into office. So, but there will be ongoing administration, obviously, sort of in perpetuity, unless, so as far as that goes with other entities, kind of maybe what the guidance would be, whether that was a discussion more with Department of Audit or I know the term unfunded mandate isn't popular with smaller entities, but just kind of what folks might think was fair if we were to deliver that to folks that weren't in our membership.
All right, so I guess my immediate reaction, and certainly the committee, the Department of Audit will be offering something that will be available and at no cost. I mean, if folks want something more robust, I think that's completely up to you to design that however you want and you'd be compensated for it however you want. I do think, and this is the discussion I had with the WAMCAT folks was exceptions matter, and that's on an individual basis. If someone's a CPA in their real life, they can be accepted from some of this requirement, the way the rules are written. I don't know all the exceptions. So the bigger one though, for an organization like you who has members and then may have third party, if you will, or other users, is who's responsible for the certifications? Is it you or is it the individual? You just say, yes, we acknowledge you took it, but you have to do all the submittals and everything. Because I think what's happening now is you're going to submit on behalf of your members. That is a different thing if you're talking about third parties participating. But I don't think this committee, I mean, I'm not going to have a recommendation. I don't know if this committee wants to get involved in that. Our role is to say, as long as the Department of Audit has a program for those folks that have access to it, you can do it. I mean, my personal view is you do what you want with your offering, and I'm sure it is a more robust offering, and maybe someday we'll increase the requirements what we do. But at this time, I don't think it. Anybody else have any feedback for Mr. Schilling? No? All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for being here. We do appreciate you working with our clerks and treasurers and county associations and all that in helping with this process.
You bet.
So Ms. Laura, did we have somebody join us online? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Ms. Mylar is town clerk for, I think, Representative Nyman's, part of Representative Nyman's district, I believe, Upton, Wyoming. So, hello, Kelly. It's great to see you. I can't see who the mascot is on the back on your wall there, but I'm sure it's, yeah, I think it might be. The colors I recognize, I just can't see the symbol. So, good morning, welcome. You can introduce yourself and then provide any testimony. That'd be great.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Kelly Millar, and I serve for the town of Upton as clerk treasurer. I appreciate your patience with me. I was not quite up to speed on getting signed up to testify before last night, and I apologize for that. We had our budget meeting till about 10 o'clock last night to pass our final appropriations ordinance. So it was not an option to drive down for me. I just wanted to let you know from the WAMCAT standpoint, we do have 155 individual members that represent 91 municipalities, and 1 special district that we provide training for through 2 institutes throughout the year, and then virtual offerings as well. Our institute has turned in the education that we do to the Department of Audit, and it's under review right now as well, so we can get some of our people certified officially with the Department of Audit. I did just have one concern. I think the training, I believe in the training, I believe it's necessary. In the exemptions is part of my concern. I have one council member who was exempted because he has an economics degree that's double majored in political science, which I think is fantastic. And he earned that with honors, so I'm very proud of him. However, when I look at his transcripts, one of the classes is ethics, and that's about all that it checks off of that list of requirements. And so my concern is that we check his name off, we check a box on an arbitrary list, and then he's one and done. There isn't an engagement to the roles and responsibilities of a clerk or a treasurer, or fiscal responsibility, accounting wise, grants wise. A lot of the other things on the list don't get checked off with that one degree. And so I wanted to be able to follow up on that, maybe with the Department of Audit, or just at least voice that concern that's it's a little bit arbitrary for me. Other than that, I think the training is going to work out well. I think communication can be better, and I think we can all work on that. Just getting this rolled out the door has been the hardest part so far.
Thank you. And I know you're one of those people that does the work, thinks about it, and then goes and does it. So I appreciate that observation, and hopefully you'll, if you're not visiting directly with the department, please do so. I think there's an analogy in this when you have reciprocity, let's say as a licensee, as a veterinary licensure. I can practice, but I still have to have some sort of jurisprudence. I have to actually understand what those state laws are, et cetera. So maybe we want to have something that maybe recognizes their fiscal understanding, but we also have a legal framework that we're talking about here too. So maybe that's something we have a nuance we build into that training requirement, that maybe they do check off part of the boxes, but maybe there's a little more. And this modular approach may be a way to get to some of that at least WHAM is implementing, and I don't know what the department is doing with theirs, but that might be a way to approach that. Ms. Mahler, anything else, Ms. Mahler?
No, I think that will be it. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you letting me testify today.
Well, we appreciate you. Is it raining in Weston County today?
Not where I'm at. It's sunshiny right now. It's going to be about 80 degrees and a little sticky today. So.
Okay, I was just checking in for Representative Nyman because he's got a lot of hay laying on the ground right now. I just wanted to give him a little bit of relief. Thank you. Thank you for that report. And thank you for having a late night and then being with us this morning. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Lohr. Anyone else on there? Any further public comment on this? Public comment? No? All right. No public comment? All right. Further discussion on anything we've heard from the Public Funds Division? Any committee action? We're going to have a follow-up discussion on the one item between staff and our staff and the Department of Audit, just to make sure if there's some clarification needed in statute, we get to that. And then we'll maybe have a proposal for our next meeting, and I'll keep in contact on that if nobody has any objection. Anything else? All right, so it is 11 o'clock. We are apparently 1 minute behind schedule. So to make it up, we have a choice of doing a potential, the choice before the committee is whether we would like to have an executive session. And I think the only purpose of this, the executive session would be to, if folks want to, is to take a look at the response to the RFP, to the contract. I don't think there's any other reason to go into executive session. Certainly not we would expect, because that's a contract matter, a legal matter, I would say. And we have 2 motions that have already been made on this item. So lacking any discussion on whether we want to proceed, any motions on proceeding to an executive session? Motions on an executive session? Seeing none, we're at 11 o'clock or 11:02 on our agenda. We are to reconvene with no executive session. We're reconvening at 1 PM. We'll start with our Senate confirmation process and then proceed to the state lands issue. Saying nothing further, we are in recess until 1 PM. Thank you.